there. Sheryl Kline here. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus with these interviews, and I can't think of a better person to start up with than with Denise Reed Lamoreaux, Chief Diversity Officer at ATOS. Denise, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I used to think that I was busy before I got on with you and we were chatting. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so, the focus of the conversation is having a real honest conversation of where we're at, but also how women and also women who are further marginalized within our gender and maybe even other marginalized groups, how we can take some control and get clarity and build confidence around what's important to us, either in our roles or getting this clarity, this micro clarity, getting very clear and building confidence prior to going into a meeting or a presentation. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to get your insights on this.
Sure. There's so much that's been done as far as research goes on these topics, but a lot of what I've really been able to make use of over the years and then interpret into courseware that I've delivered here as part of my diversity programs is this concept of communicating with power. Too often, women have a tendency to give away their power by being too nice, too polite, too tentative in the phrases that they use. So you've done the research. You pulled together this presentation that is full of very solid data points and resources and references and so forth. And you get to the meeting and you do the presentation and then you say, I think this is the way to go forward. And so all of a sudden, as soon as you say the word, I think, the audience thinks that you didn't really think at all. And the power has been greatly diminished in what you had to say. Men will come in and say, this is the solution. Women say, I think we should go this way. So one of the biggest favors you can do yourself is to remove those tentative statements. Another trap we fall into is when somebody says to us, what's the deadline to get this back to you? Oh, ASAP. We say ASAP, and our definition is completely different from theirs. We have to be specific and say Friday is the deadline and go even further and say at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So there's no gray. And there is, very clear indication about when things need to be back to the individual by. And another thing we do is we assume that people understand who to go to with questions after a meeting is done, where they can find resources to further study or go back and look at something again. And we need to provide that hard copy documentation to people. We assume they're going to remember it, but there's all this research that indicates that 20 minutes after someone leaves a meeting, they've forgotten 40% of what was covered. So if we don't hand them or give them the URL to this information that they need to have to move forward, then we can't expect that they're going to retain it. There's too much going on. We pay continuous partial attention. And unless we really provide them with those resources, then whatever it is we're trying to get across to them will be lost, and we will be behind the eight ball in trying to be successful in what we wanted them to set out to do.
Yeah, so I really love that. So important. So it seems like you're saying that women need to really stand in their power and be highly confident in their voice and their ideas, and maybe stop asking for permission.
Yeah.
And removing some of these statements that kind of let the air out of some very powerful ideas. And that too comes across, it seems, and let me know if you agree with this, but a lot of times, I think it's 80% of women tend to lose influence because they end on an ascension. So even if they say the right, it's like you're saying, what do you think? And even if they say the right words, if their voice is on an ascension, it's almost like they're asking permission. And it kind of, if they're not confident in themselves and in their mind, then of course others, it's going to be challenging for others to be confident. So that, and then being really specific with deadlines. I couldn't agree with you more. And it seems like, and do you agree that this comes a lot from permission and confidence. So permission to land the plane, permission to own an idea, even if it's a little crazy or unusual or innovative or goes against the grain, but just standing firm in that power and then being specific on your expectations from people. Would you believe that it starts with mindset even before they speak or understand exactly what to do or how to say it?
Absolutely. And, one of the biggest favors you can do for yourself is really widen your circle of trust, first of all, and ask people who don't think like you to give you feedback on how you presented, how you came across, how you really were able to make your points, because that's the feedback you need to make improvements. And too often we'll go to people that we like, that we have an affinity with, that we've seen agreement with in the past for that feedback. And what they'll say is, oh yeah, you sounded great, good information, nicely put together, but you can't make any improvements when they're just giving you this vague kind of feedback. So go to someone who you have actually heard speak out a little bit differently in a meeting and ask that person for their feedback on how well you did, because we present, we develop, we deliver to our way of thinking. We are not always thinking about the other ways people think when we're doing that. So if we want it to really resonate, we need to get some feedback that will be constructive, that we can actually move forward and do something with. And too often we're too scared to do that. So be that bold person and take that risk, because it pays off really enormously.
Yeah. So that being said, to piggyback onto that idea, is it possible that you want to ask someone that you might necessarily not like that much or might not want to have lunch with, someone who's brutally honest, where it comes from a great place, not someone who's mean and malicious that just like to make themselves feel better, want to kind of pick apart what you're doing, but someone who is just kind of a straight shooter and lays it, all in their sleeve. I mean, if it's possible to really go after someone like that, who, like I said, maybe you don't want to have lunch with anytime soon.
And that's a really good way of putting it. A comfort zone is a beautiful place, right? But nothing changes there. So unless you're willing to go to that person who really might be oppositional to you in some ways, you will not truly get a chance to react and grow. So you got to put that brave face forward. You really need to take that leap of faith. And it's a risk because, you may feel personally affronted by some of the things that they have to say, but it is a professional setting. Ask that person for their feedback, be respectful about it. And then once they give it to you, regardless of whether or not you 100% agree with it, thank them. And then take it even one step further and say, if there's something I can do for you in the future, I'd really love to be able to do that because you were so generous with your time with me. And you never know, it may form this allyship that originally you would have never wanted to have lunch with that person. And by the end of the year, you're sitting next to each other in meetings. So there can be that sea change and that new relationship that comes from this professional bravery.
Yeah. And let me, if you don't mind, if I take this to the nth degree and ask you something, put something out there that's even a little crazy. What about asking someone who is not only a straight shooter, but someone who you're thinking in your mind, a senior leader, someone who you're thinking in your mind, oh, I don't want to bother that person. That person's not going to get back to me. Or I am not, now we're going to have an honest conversation here. I am not worthy of getting the input from that person. Would you advise people to go after those few-minute conversations and get that feedback?
Absolutely. And you know what? We are all worthy of that kind of feedback. This is when the imposter syndrome who sits on your shoulder takes over and says, you aren't really that great. And you really shouldn't be asking that person. When I came into this company 6.5 years ago, I didn't know anybody. I was new and I had to make my way. And very early on, I asked probably the most senior woman I had had any exposure to at that time. She was the CEO of one of the countries that I, work with regularly, to provide me with feedback on my performance and what she felt about one of the presentations I had given in her presence. And she was very generous with her time. And if I hadn't asked her those questions, I wouldn't have had that early clue into culture that I really needed to be able to make that next wave of development happen for myself so that I could advance even more. So yes, I was brave and I was bold and I was scared, but I did it, and it really paid enormous dividends. And even though she's no longer with the company, we still keep in touch with one another. I just had a conversation with her yesterday via LinkedIn, and that relationship continues to feed some of my development.
Yeah, and I so appreciate your transparency. It's not like I did this and I'm amazing. It's like I was scared half to death, but I did it anyway. So
I was.
because at the end of the day, that's what's going to kind of nudge people off into the deep end a little bit, so to speak. And also there's a different. I mean, let's just ask too about the perspective. It could be the conversation around I am worthy, but it could also, if you reflect and let's say that you didn't give yourself permission and that you didn't feel worthy and you kind of played small when it came to the big ask that you were going for, it's a disservice to yourself, but who else would have suffered if you didn't do that?
Mm-hmm. And, if you want to be known as a role model, you have to be bold and you have to step out there a little bit. And I'm actually in the process of starting my own book. It hasn't gone very far yet, but it's kind of along these lines. And this giving yourself permission to be bold and to take that next step in action that is really holding people back. And regardless of where you come from, you can still be impacted by this sense of, I shouldn't try this. But, my book is actually, as I said, just very early days in my head most of the way, but it will definitely talk on that topic quite a bit.
Yeah, so important. And to get that book out there, because when I wrote Zoned In, it was like, women in the workplace, especially those who are further marginalized, their voice needs to be heard now more than ever. And it's like their Olympics, right?
I love that.
And so I really want to honor you and putting on my coach's hat, giving you a nudge to get that scheduled and carve out the time in your busy day to get that done. And so moving forward, you were talking about imposter syndrome, which has been kind of a public, very popular topic. But when we talk about microaggressions, it seems like that's also been talked about quite a bit as well. And it's also seems to me from the research that I've done recently, it's from how do we not commit microaggressions unknowingly? It's from the conversation of, 80% of the people are not nasty, awful people who are trying to do nasty, awful things. So how do we educate ourselves and not commit microaggressions? But if we can look at it from a different angle and say that if we are on the receiving end of a microaggression, how can we come at it from a place of compassion and grace so we can have the biggest impact and kind of influencing people on the fly rather than kind of sinking back and allowing our emotions to get the most of us and getting very angry or annoyed, which quite frankly is 100% understandable. But I want to understand if you think it's very important for women to really take control of from their end what they have control over and how they respond to these things, kind of for the greater good.
Yeah, because every time you remain silent, that means that this situation could happen again. And, we actually just did a session yesterday for our people that was led by myself and my program manager, Mathilde Gibert, on what was called handling conflict in a multicultural environment. And one of the things we talked about was this concept of when you said X, I felt Y. And it's non-judgmental, it's non-confrontational. It's simply sharing with that person who committed the microaggression against you that it shows what you felt and how it made you feel and what the impact of that was. And when people hear that, they're like, oh my goodness, that was absolutely not my intent. I wasn't even considering. And one thing we really focus on a lot with our people in the concept of inclusive communications, and this is a really good example of a microaggression, is using the language of disability and saying something like, well, that was a lame idea, or I was paralyzed by indecision and didn't know what to do. We're not saying this to be rude. We're not saying this to kind of take away from, the fact of a person who may be paralyzed and what they feel like and so forth. But we don't even realize that that's a microaggression. And it's become part of our vernacular. We see things like this all the time. So when someone who is disabled says to someone who has said something like that, when you said this, I felt that. All of a sudden, it's a moment of clarity for that person so that they can remember that and not commit that same kind of situation again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that can be really scary.
Yeah. And it's hard to stand up, especially if they're senior to you. But it's really important to be very low-key about it and just state the absolutes.
Yeah, and then going back to mindset, and being unapologetic, this needs to be unapologetic too, don't you think, to land? Because if you say to someone, I and they're kind of dancing around it, because they're thinking in their mind, I don't want to overreact, I don't want to be a nuisance, I don't want them to think of me this way or that way, or that's, they're not confident in their mindset before saying this, then it's not going to land as they have intended.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, and then last question on this topic, do you feel that it's important to acknowledge maybe the person who is either knowingly or likely unknowingly committed the microaggression? Is it important to acknowledge and validate their perspective? So in other words, it seems like this was probably not your intent, and I understand that 100%, just to kind of preface what's coming.
Yeah, and that's a really great way to begin the conversation so that it doesn't feel like an attack or a criticism or a you should have done it this ways. Because we want to have that open communication and that non-judgmental communication, so we can't come at it in a judgmental way ourselves. We just need to say, I'm pretty sure that you were unaware of the impact of what you just said, but here's some background on that. And here's why I wanted to make sure we had a moment to talk about this. And when you have a conversation like this, it's not going to be comfortable at first, but by the end of the conversation, you'll 99.99% of the time find that the other person is going away with something new that they can do differently the next time. So, take that brave step and actually do it. And if you're not comfortable in the moment, ask to speak to the person at a later time, but don't wait a week, because then it'll have lost its emphasis. Just like if you've got a puppy and you're trying to train that puppy not to go to the bathroom in the house, you can't wait till the next week to, show them the accident on the floor. They're not going to even equate it to anything. So you have to be in the moment, as close to the moment as you can, to make it have any real impact.
Yeah. So when you're training someone, you've got to do it swiftly.
Yeah.
So it has its relevance.
Absolutely.
So they don't pee on the floor again. So that's just memorable. I mean, I'm being funny. These situations are not funny, but they can help what you're saying to be Absolutely. More memorable, because when something's happened, levity does help too. Mm-hmm. So if a microaggression was committed and you're like, nope, not going to pee on the floor again, it might give you that kind of funny yet not funny nudge to know the importance of speaking up.
Right.
And so, excuse me, let's shift for a second and talk about a book and a resource that your leadership has put out there. It's called, for short, it's called The Way, but The Way to Finding Peace in Turbulent Times. And I think it's safe to say that we're in turbulent times. now, and it seems like incredibly relevant work. So can you share from a high level a little bit about what it's about and how it's really helping the people at ATOS?
Absolutely. So Vernon Sankey and his co-author, Katie Lockwood, pulled together this book, which we used as one of our book club discussions topics in 2020. So we choose books every year that are based on diversity and inclusion related topics, mainly focusing on inclusivity versus exclusivity, etc. And the way was really there to kind of provide that framework for people to function within, to gain better clarity, to get clear on their goals, to really set some motivational factors into their lives and so forth. And so the book was wonderful. We all enjoyed reading it, having our book club discussion. Katie and Vernon joined us in our book club discussion. And then they took it one step further and have now created a workbook that goes along with the book. You can do them together or separately, but this book is full of guided meditations and reflection exercises and opportunities to come together as a cohort and discuss what you've learned and gleaned and understood and are now applying and so forth. But it is a true way to lead the way for your own self-awareness, self-development, self-improvement, and just self-satisfaction more than anything else. I highly recommend it. Our pilot group that went through the program have all come out of it changed, and it's definitely been a benefit for all of us to be involved. And it's available via Amazon.
Yeah, and if you're a part of my community, we'll be writing this up. You'll get it in the show notes via a blog. If you're not, then you can join for free at SherylKline.com, and we'll make sure that you get the link to that. And also, so as long as we're, being real honest, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you one more kind of last very raw question, if that's okay. And that as women, and also women who are further marginalized within the gender, what are the gaps or the blind spots that you're seeing where we could do a better job of taking care of ourselves and moving the cause forward to making it better for the female leaders coming behind us?
Well, I don't know how much you've heard about the concept called the glass cliff, where women, and especially women of color, are often given leadership opportunities when the project is already in trouble. And there's not really a clear indication whether there will be a turnaround or not. And often what happens is this woman, finds herself in this leadership role and doesn't necessarily have allies within this team that she is now working directly with. So unless she is brave, stands up and starts asking questions, making allies within this team, finding out the facts that she needs to be able to move forward with, aligning to the work and putting together action reports and status reports and doing root cause analysis and so forth, she will not be able to turn that project around. She has to have that boldness and that almost in your face type of attitude that I'm here to ask these questions. I need these answers. I need it by Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern time to be able to move forward, to be successful as a team. But she can't be all I. She has to have, the I in team, even though that doesn't exist. But you know what I'm saying here. But it's a paradox that exists that if the project then fails, well, then she may not get another opportunity to lead something because she wasn't a successful leader. So she has to form the allies herself. She can't wait for somebody to come to her and say, hey, I'm here to help. She needs to go out there and ask those questions, get that feedback from someone who she may not want to have lunch with, as you mentioned earlier, and really take that to heart, formulate her plan, communicate the plan, always celebrate whatever good is happening, acknowledge the knowledge of the people that are involved, thank them, offer to help them, and continue to showcase herself as that trusted resource to be able to get that buy-in from the people who are sitting back saying, she's not going to be able to do this. Because once they see demonstration of what she's capable of accomplishing, then most of the time the allies fall in line. but you have to acknowledge the knowledge that's there and thank them and make sure that others know that of what they're doing.
So then that I haven't heard of that term glass cliff, and it's so important to be aware of. And I've seen it before where maybe women might take on a project because they feel like they have to, or they feel like it's needed for, to develop a certain profile or what have you. But is it important to get very clear, like you said, on what's needed and explain why, and stand in the power of politely declining if they're not given the resources?
Absolutely. It is very difficult to say no because you feel that you have let someone down by saying no. But one of the biggest powers we have to give ourselves is the ability to say no, and no with, whatever caveat needs to be added to it. No, there's no way I can fit that into my schedule at this time. No, but I could help you out next month. No, I'd love to be involved in that. However, it's outside of my scope of responsibility, and I will, give whatever resources I can, but there will be a limit to what I can do. To stand in our power here and really say this career option for me will be beneficial or not is something we really have to do. And it's a SWOT analysis. It's, looking at our list of our strengths and really determining, is this something that we can be successful at right here, right now? Or would this mean I need, a certification? Or would it mean that I need to be mentored specifically in this area, and so forth? Will I be able to be, to some degree, successful here or not? We can't know everything, and yet we expect ourselves to know everything. And we don't give ourselves that permission to recognize when there may be a time where we are not in the know enough to take that step forward. So, to be that bold person, you also have to know where to stop, where to start, and where to make sure you're flourishing and continuing to develop. And it's not going to be every single topic. Myself, I have no interest in becoming any more technical than I am right now. And yet that could have taken me down a completely different path with my career. I made the decision that was not for me. And I work in the tech environment. So I could have been something different, but I'm perfectly happy with what I am at this point.
Yeah, and it seems, it just reminds me of a story of a client who is a president of an arm of a bank, and she got asked to take on a very large project. And it was also making a big ask. So it was important to her, but she didn't necessarily want to take it on or think that she could take it on. There was no way she needed 3 to 5 headcount. There's no way that she thought she would get any. But she planned for that, and that was the ask, or she was going to politely decline. And lo and behold, it wasn't even a question. And so a lot of times too, it's being aware of what is reality and what's our reality. Our reality is there no way that I would get headcount or support, but that might be different than reality. And maybe it's would you agree that it's really important getting clear that what's needed to do the job and what the big asks are?
Absolutely. And the big asks really should be something terrifically bold. And if they say no, then there's still room for negotiation. You can say, but what if, or why not, or can't we try? And then there's still that room for, that discussion to take place, wherein you may end up with most of what your big ask was, if not 100% of it. But, just like if you were negotiating to purchase a car, of course, you're going to go in there with a low ball offer, and they'll come back and say, no, we can go to here. And you're like, well, can you meet me halfway there? And everybody wins in that situation. So it's that understanding the limit to what you can go to, but then pushing it just that wee bit further to be able to have that maybe extra resource, or, if you're negotiating for more time off in your contract and so forth, just push it just a little bit more and see what happens. but also to recognize and thank them for considering this bold ask, because they're going to be like, what? And you have to say, I am coming to you with a very big request. I recognize it. I respect you, and I thank you for considering it. And then leave it on the table and let them digest it. Too often we expect immediate reactions. Sometimes it takes, 48 hours or so for them to come back to you. And that time seems like it's forever, but you have to allow it to be so that they can come up with their answers too.
And do you think it's most important to start with something small and influence up, or to go big and influence down, or negotiate down?
You'll do both at different times. And it's really going to be a balancing act to determine which way you need to go, especially if you're involved in some kind of change activity. You need to have everyone aligned. But where do you start? Do you start with the workers who will be most impacted by this change, or do you start at that very senior level? And in a change effort, you really should start with the people who will be most impacted by what that change consists of, so that they form the allyship with you, because there's power in numbers, right? And the more you can demonstrate that, we are seeing very good progress against these deliverables from Team A. Team B has already figured out their contingency plan. They're ready to move forward. They've done their due diligence. They're doing beta testing. And the more you can give that, here's what's happening against this change report to those higher level people, the more they're going to see that it is going to be a success. And you can ask for that big ask at that point and say something like, we need, at least 2 more resources on Team B, because they have 4 people out on disability right now, and be very honest with them so that they can understand, yes, they're allies of ours now, but we need to provide them with some further ammunition so they can increase their allyship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to make a lot of sense. And so what do you want to leave people with? So in other words, what's your call to action? Is there anything that you want people to do or remember?
We talked a lot about bold asks and owning your power and things along those lines, but it also is all about the acknowledging of the knowledge of your colleagues. And the more you thank them, that attitude of gratitude, this will serve you well. You'll be considered a trusted resource. You're reaching out to people you might not normally reach out to ask for advice and guidance. That shows them your faith in them. And these small acts over time add up to big dividends. And when you find yourself in need of support, then these people are going to be right there behind you, because they've seen you act with integrity. They've seen you really reach out and ask for assistance, take constructive criticism to heart and apply whatever the advice was in a practical, meaningful way. And also thanking people for what they did for you and offering to assist them in the future will really align them to understanding that you are a person of integrity.
Yeah, such great advice. And it seems like when it comes to eliciting real change, especially during turbulent times, it's really helpful to have your leadership on board, as you have been and as your leadership has been at ATOS. Is there anything else, or a tip or a strategy when it comes to helping companies to not just talk about things, but to really elicit change, so everyone in the organization can really surrender to their best work and not have it, debilitated by some of these other things that are going on in the workplace?
Well, we all own the responsibility of creating belonging moments for our colleagues. So what do I really mean by that? Well, everybody needs to be able to be their authentic self in the workplace, to be able to be truly productive, innovative, creative, and settle into the work and get things done on time, above and beyond, ahead of schedule, within budget, etc. if they don't feel comfortable, if they don't feel valued, if they don't feel like they're accepted, how can they really perform at their best? So it is up to us to create those belonging moments. And whether it's sitting with that guy at lunch that you wouldn't normally want to sit with,
Well, I'm going to be known for that.
We really are.
I should have never said
That's
that.
the thing. Whether it's, saying in a meeting, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable because, whether it's taking that moment to say, I really liked what you had to say there, and I'd like to discuss that topic with you a little further after today's meeting. Any of those small actions you can take to make sure that you acknowledge the others and really kind of give credit where credit is due will really go a long way towards helping them feel more like they're valued and appreciated. And we all know that when someone feels like they're acknowledged for their efforts, they're going to give just that much more effort to the next piece of work. So it really comes around full circle to us. But we all own belonging moments, not for ourselves to make ourselves feel good, but to make sure that our colleagues and our leaders feel the appreciation we have for them and for what they do.
Yeah, and I love that term, belonging moments. I haven't heard that either. So maybe I feel like I'm well versed in D&I because I've talked to so many amazing women like yourself and amazing male allies as well. But I really love that because it takes us away from thinking of the big, unwieldy, hairy monster of shifting cultures so they're more ideal. That sometimes gets a little bit frustrating and demoralizing, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And these belonging moments seem like something that we can all do, speak up for ourselves, but maybe even, do you think it's important to take it a step further? And for me, for example, to pull you aside or pull a colleague aside and say, Denise, I just wanted to check in on you. We're focused on having these belonging moments. How are you doing? How did you feel in that meeting? So being proactive on the other end as well. And that might be really helpful to elicit change, to have it on both ends. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I love that concept because too often we're just, focused on the business, not on the people care side of things, not because we don't care about the people care. It's just that, we pay continuous partial attention. We're pulled in 24 different directions simultaneously, and we forget. It's not that we don't care. It's just that we prioritize things that are deadlines and so forth more stringently. So yes, a check-in, just a simple, one thing we've been doing during COVID is how is everyone doing? How is everyone feeling? How many times were you asked how you felt a couple of years ago on a conference call? You probably weren't asked very often. So it is really important to continue that trend, not give it up, but to, create those belonging moments wherever you have that opportunity to do so. And just like they say, you'll never know the impact you truly have on others, because what you say today may still resonate with them 10 years from now. And you just won't even know that. But if you've done that, your due diligence, and tried your best to be that person for your team, it's going to have innumerable benefits.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's kind of like the random acts of kindness. You could have random belonging moments where you pull someone aside and say, not only what is the impact that you felt like you had, but how do you feel like you were treated in that meeting? And then they in turn will probably be more likely to do the same for someone on their team, not because they weren't a nice person before, but it probably wasn't on their dashboard.
Yeah. A few years ago, there was a movement called Operation Beautiful, and it was actually started by a young woman who was body shamed. And she decided that she was going to write affirming messages on Post-it notes and leave them wherever she was going. And so it would say something like, you are worthy, or you have value, or you look great today. And she would just stick this Post-it note on a mirror in a public bathroom and on the subway station walls, wherever. And it started this whole movement where people were then, saying that Post-it note stopped me from, stepping off the subway path and getting in front of a train, or from, making a career mistake, or from staying in an abusive relationship, or whatever. And this Operation Beautiful movement actually became a true thing. So it's just that moment, that one or two words that can make all the difference to someone.
Yeah, so I think there's a hashtag in our future, hashtag belonging moments.
Yeah, I love that.
Now, I had promised that we would wrap up this interview early, but you have been sharing so much gold that we're almost at time. So thank you so very much for your time and your leadership, and really encouraging us all to have belonging moments for ourselves, where we create them for ourselves, where we speak up for ourselves. But also when we pull people aside that maybe seem like on the outside they're doing fine, and pulling them aside privately and saying, how did you feel in that meeting? Do you feel like you were heard? Is there anything you want to share with me? And being proactive on the other end. And I think those micro actions from both sides could be really powerful in the ripple effect and really having real change. Congratulations to you and your role at ATOS, as well as your leadership's commitment. And I look forward to following your impact.
Thank you for having me here today. It was a wonderful privilege for me. Thanks. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks so much.